Hello everyone, my name is Aaron and I am the Monk on Fire. What I want to talk about today is continue on the conversation with regard to the Star Wars story because I think it's important exercise in how we look at myth. And I'm very fascinated right now about the breaking down of the myth and how Kathleen Kennedy and Rian Johnson together have somehow broken the myth. They were the myth keepers. They were those entrusted as keepers of the myth. And because of this exchange that happens between the myth keepers and the myth hearers within a culture, whereby the myth keepers aren't free just to tell the myth any old way they want to, they have to maintain that step, operate within those parameters that is expected by the myth hearers. You see this in many cultures where those that tell the myth, the sacred myths of a culture, have to operate within that. Otherwise, if they step outside of that, if they go beyond the parameters, then it can break the myth, or in essence, they break faith with keeping the myth, and they get considerable. They can have considerable backlash from those that are entrusted them to keep the myth, and therefore, if the myth keepers don't keep the myth as they ought to, if they're not good stewards of the myth, then their following actually breaks down. You see this actually happen in political uprisings. You can see this happen in religious reforms. The Great Reformation of the Christian era and the medieval Christian era happens as part of that exchange too. And so what happens is that people who have their power because they are stewards of the myth, and they have that power by being faithful stewards of the myth, if they fail in that office, that actually can reduce their power. In a free market, you actually see this by the loss of revenue. People simply don't show up at your movie in order to simply keep paying you the money when you are not executing your function as stewards of the myth. And I see this happening with Lucasfilm right now. It's a very fascinating thing to watch it unfold in real time. You can see this observable in other cultures, but to watch it unfold, I'm really fascinated to watch this. And one of the things I notice is that the Last Jedi, it didn't just break the myth all by itself. What it did is it created such a deviation from the myth that it created another avenue of retroactively interpreting what had come before. Oftentimes we have in our lives, in various different ways of interpreting things, this idea of retroactive interpretation. This also goes into the course I teach on interpretive methods for sacred literature. Say, for example, the Bible. There's a discipline known as hermeneutics. Hermeneutics is a fancy term that has its root in the Greek god Hermes, who brought the message. And this idea of hermeneutics is the bringing of the message, or oftentimes extrapolating the message from something else. Hermeneutics, technically speaking, is the science and art of interpretation. You engage in it all the time. Anytime someone sends you a text referencing an inside joke, and you know that person, therefore you're able to interpret the message in a way that others would not because you know the text author, you're engaging in hermeneutics. The Supreme Court of the United States, as they look at the Constitution and apply it to a particular present-day situation, is engaging in hermeneutics. We engage in hermeneutics all the time. It's the science and art of interpretation. And the science in that it has specific components whereby you can do it responsibly, but it's an art form in the sense that you get better at it the more you do it too. So hermeneutics is the science and art of interpretation, and it's interpreting a method, or interpreting a message, interpreting a text, interpreting a story, and looking for its meaning. Well, we do this all the time, and we even do this in interpreting people's behaviors. We see a person engage in a certain behavior and say, okay, I think that this is the motivation or the mentality behind that behavior. We're interpreting their behavior. Well, there's what I refer to as retroactive hermeneutics also. And retroactive hermeneutics is you're going along with someone and you've been noticing their behavior for quite some time, and then all of a sudden you find out something new about them, and what that is, it retroactively reinterprets behaviors that you've seen before. What behaviors that you used to think are simply quirky are now make sense in light of new data. You go, oh, I see what that makes sense now. And so you retroactively interpret what things you had seen before based upon new data. Bible scholars see the New Testament writers as engaging in this, where what's oftentimes referred to as the Old Testament is the only Bible available to the first century writers, those that wrote the New Testament. Their Bible of the time was the Hebrew Bible, or the what's called Old Testament. Well, what happens is according to Christian tradition, they had this encounter with this rabbi, this first century Judean rabbi, and Jesus of Nazareth, and their encounters with that person are such that it reinterprets how they used to read their scriptures. So in essence, now they reread their scriptures, their sacred text, what's in the Christian tradition called the Old Testament. That now is, you have a new light being shed on that they didn't see before. They have some sort of encounter that causes them to reinterpret those old texts in light of the new data. So in essence, now they see Jesus in all those old scriptures of the Hebrew Bible. Many can see that as reading into it, but they would say, no, it's just they have new data that enables them, supposedly, according to the Christian tradition, they have new data that enables them to interpret those old texts in a new light. This is referred to as, I refer to see this as retroactive hermeneutics. You get new data that causes you to reinterpret the things you previously known. Well, this is what happened. You say, how does that apply to the Star Wars question? Well, I liked the Force Awakens, Star Wars: The Force Awakens. I saw it as a worthy a reboot of a tradition that had an original trilogy, had some prequels that were difficult to reconcile. I mean, because of directing and acting, how that happened. Even though, as I argued before, the novels were well done. But it needed new life. It needed a reboot. It needed the Star Wars myth needed to be resurrected, if you will, from the ashes of its previous treatments. As a movie tradition, it needed to be reborn as a movie tradition. I felt like the Force Awakens, Star Wars Episode 7, The Force Awakens, did that. I liked it initially. I actually saw it several times in the theater. And then, of course, you have Rogue One, and then The Last Jedi comes out. And The Last Jedi, with how it treated these characters such as Finn and Rey, and even how it treated even the horrible way with which it treated the traditional characters such as Luke and Leia. What that did is it so broke the myth, it so damaged the myth that it allowed you to engage in retroactive hermeneutics, whereby you now, because of The Last Jedi, it allowed you to retroactively look at The Force Awakens and say, okay, I didn't realize Rey was such a flat character when I watched The Force Awakens. She gains all this power. By the end of The Force Awakens, you're amazed by the ability that comes to her in such a short amount of time. Jedi mind tricks, the lightsaber coming to her hand, and she's able to best in her first lightsaber duel the most feared villain at the time. And we say, well, was Kylo Ren the most feared villain? Kylo Ren is doing things with the Force in the Force Awakens that we didn't see Vader do in all the original trilogy. We didn't really see him stop blaster bolts midair. We saw him deflect blaster bolts, and we saw him, but we didn't see him stop them midair. We didn't see him call people across the room. We saw him force choke people. We didn't see him, telekinetically bring people across the room to him. The Force Awakens did created a situation whereby Kylo Ren was supposedly more powerful than what we saw of Vader, and Rey's able to beat him the first movie. Luke isn't able to get the upper hand on Vader until the third movie, but Rey's able to beat Kylo Ren in the first film, the first time she ever picks up a lightsaber and turns it on. So the idea is that what that is up the ante of having to expect that her origins or the explanations for why she's so powerful is going to be demonstrated or shown to us in the next. Well, Force Awakens, what it did is it successfully robbed Rey of any interesting qualities, such that it retroactively sucked any interest out of her origins, why she's so powerful. She's simply a superhero. She's simply born disability, and she has no other virtue because she doesn't have to struggle for it. She doesn't have to train for it. She has nothing else going for her other than she's a girl she's a girl on a desert planet whose story parallels Luke Skywalker's enough. She doesn't require any training. She doesn't require a mentor. She's even able to supposedly overcome even her Luke Skywalker, who we all thought was going to be the greatest Jedi ever. So the idea was that with regard to retroactive hermeneutics, the Last Jedi was able to break the myth such that it retroactively turned our attention toward The Force Awakens and realized, oh, it's not as good a movie as I originally thought. Because for me, and this is why I try to explain why some really liked it, others really didn't. But then some really liked episode 7, The Force Awakens, and then later on changed their mind. Why change their mind? Well, because The Last Jedi causes you to reinterpret the previous data and realize, I see, it was building up to nothing. It wasn't built up to anything. It was a build up to nothing. And as a result, it robs it of any meaning. So there's a sense in which I've seen some buzz about people trying to reboot, or excuse me, to redo The Last Jedi. That's not going to be enough. You're going to have to reboot this new trilogy. You're going to have to completely scrap this current trilogy and start over with new characters, new writers, because we're 2 movies into a new trilogy now that can be interpreted and be shown to be a complete breaking of the myth. In a postmodern nihilistic sort of way, where there's nothing of meaning that is going to be developed. The only meaning that kind of the nihilistic postmodern social justice warriors get, the only meaning they derive from being keepers of the myth, is how they can destroy it. That seems to be the mentality of Lucasfilm and Kathleen Kennedy right now. The only meaning they have in life is how to break down previous myths. They get the mantle of being stewards of the myth, and therefore they only demonstrate their agency, their power. They only demonstrate that they matter in the world by how can they tear down things that came before it, because ultimately they're really angry that anything of any meaning was developed before them. So that's my take. That's my explanation as to why The Force Awakens could be in the current Star Wars myth, why something could start out popular and then you so deviate, you so break the myth that it actually retroactively does away with the previous interest. You're not going to be able to fix this with episode 9. You're going to have to start over with a new trilogy. And basically this current flock of Star Wars is going to go the way, this current flock of Star Wars movies is going to go the way of the Amazing Spider-Man movies. Where people completely, it's completely forgettable, and you're going to go for a time, and then you can reboot it again. So I think that's what we're going to see. That's my 2 cents, and thank you for listening. And hopefully, let's continue the conversation.